Well, let's take a look now at the narrowing presidential field as we get ready to head into the month of May. All right, so what does that mean? It means 6 months left before the 2012 election. I think it's fair to say the Republican establishment viewpoint as of today can be summed up pretty simply. And I will give the honors to President George H.W. or Daddy Bush.
I do think it's time for party to get behind Governor Romney. And she was reminding me, Kenny Rogers song, it's time when to hold him, it's time when to fold him. Well, I think it's time for people to all get behind this good man.
But not everyone thinks it's time to fold him. And even those who may eventually throw their support and their political weight behind the, quote, presumptive nominee don't really seem excited to do so. Take a look.
Mitt Romney is going to be the nominee, and I'm going to support the nominee, whoever that nominee is, period.
Well, that's Mitt Romney.
Well, that's what it looks like, yeah.
But I hear you saying you're not yet ready to say, I'm endorsing Mitt Romney, but you will at some point.
Well, as the line says in The Wizard of Oz, all in good time, my pretty. It will happen.
All right, so the landscape has changed. Rick Santorum is out. Newt Gingrich is scheduled to back out this week. So that leaves just two men, Mitt Romney and Ron Paul. So what about Ron Paul? And how may things change now that there are just two men left standing? Let's go to Brian Doherty, a senior editor for Reason.com. He also wrote the book Ron Paul Revolution, The Man and the Movement Inspired. Hey there, Brian. Okay, we'll break down some numbers in a moment, but let me just get your take on how you see the next 6 months for Ron Paul playing out here.
Ron Paul is going to continue to fight it out to the end, as he has reiterated again and again. He's going to keep on racking up delegates. He almost certainly is not going to rack up enough delegates to deny Mitt Romney his first ballot victory, but he is going to signal to the Republican Party that they have to pay attention to him, his fans, and his ideas. And it's going to mean a very different Republican Party moving forward, whether Mitt Romney wins or loses against Obama in November.
I do want to put some of those numbers up on the screen. These numbers are emerging in terms of delegate count. And, I should mention they're a little fluid, but here's what we're seeing right now. This is kind of on that road to getting the 1,144 needed. The total right now, Romney's got 847 and Ron Paul has 80. But now that the other guys are no longer running, we do want to do just a few compare and contrasts. Let's take a look at Iowa. Both men have 7 delegates. Minnesota, Mitt Romney has 2, Ron Paul has 9. In North Dakota, Mitt Romney has 7 delegates, Ron Paul has 8. And in Maine, another close one, Mitt Romney has 11 delegates and Ron Paul has 9. Brian, these are just a few states here with some close numbers. How does Ron Paul get to a place where the gap, at least, becomes a little smaller?
In some of these caucus states, the process of actually picking who their delegates are going to vote for in Tampa is still ongoing. So I think all of these numbers need to be taken with a grain of salt right now. But what he has to do moving forward, remember Virginia, the state where all the other candidates neglected to even get themselves on the ballot. Ron Paul did very well against Romney, got around 40%. I think you're going to see him racking up numbers like that in many states. And in some states, like California particularly, you can win delegates without winning the state as a whole. You can win on congressional district levels. Again, none of this means that Ron Paul is going to close that gap and be the nominee on the first ballot. What it does mean is he is going to prove the validity of a strongly anti-war, seriously anti-spending, actually constitutionalist force within the Republican Party. I mean, they've talked a small government game for decades. None of them have ever meant it except Ron Paul. And the fact that he's still in there means that those people need to be minded by the political establishment. I think it's an interesting point when you bring up the small government aspect that Ron Paul holds. Another group does hold that aspect, the Tea Party, who we saw do very well in 2010. Something very interesting happened involving both the Ron Paul and the Tea Party. They sort of joined forces recently in Alaska, and now the new heads of the state GOP there, they're both Ron Paul supporters. I think as far as I know, this is pretty unprecedented that, the heads of a state party are both Ron Paul supporters. What's going on here? I'm glad you brought that up, and the same is true of Iowa as well. There's two different games that the Paul people are playing now. One is the delegate game, which we've been talking about, but more important in the long term is the taking over local and state Republican Party game, which the Paul people are also getting very, very good at. Alaska and Iowa are pretty much theirs, and California is being worked on in that same regard. it's pretty much the strategy that the so-called religious right played in 1988. If everyone remembers Pat Robertson's insurgent failed campaign for the presidency, he did not win, but his people did what the Ron Paul people are doing now. They strategically used their numbers and their passion to sort of swing above their weight in actually taking over party positions. And that is going to shape the party down the line. It will shape the kind of candidates who arise. It will shape basically what is considered serious and real. That was one of Ron Paul's big problems all year, is people just thought, oh yeah, sounds interesting, but he's a kooky outlier. When everyone you're seeing at your local Republican Party meetings are Ron Paul people, you're going to start taking Ron Paul more seriously. And of course, going forward, it's not going to be Ron Paul himself, but it's going to be maybe Rand Paul. It's going to be other candidates who believe what Ron Paul believes. And the Republican Party, with every one of these Ron Paul people who enters, wins positions of authority, by definition, the Republican Party becomes more like Ron Paul, and that's going to be great for America in the future, I think.
And one of the things that Ron Paul supporters always say and point out is how consistent he's been over the years, longer than I've been alive, that he's been in politics, and really just saying the same things. When you talk about other Republicans, other conservatives adopting some of his ideologies, it's already started to happen in some aspects. We see things, criticism of the Fed, criticism of a large government. Some even talk about bringing back the gold standard. But one of the biggest problems, and I'm not talking about legalizing marijuana or anything like that, one of the biggest problems is that most conservatives tend to be very pro-military and pro-war. You have a lot of them are in bed with the defense contractors. How does, how do people who want to adopt more of his ideologies, that seems to be one that's just not going to happen. What do you think, Brian?
You've absolutely pinpointed his biggest problem in winning the affection of your basic Tea Party right. I mean, by most standards, Ron Paul should have been the Tea Party's favorite by acclamation. He's the only one who has a serious plan to actually balance the budget within 5 years with no taxes raised. He has a consistent record over 30 years, never voting for unbalanced budgets, never voting for more taxes, never voting for more spending. Yet they've had a hard time embracing him, and you pinpointed one of the reasons, the foreign policy. What he's been very good at doing on the campaign trail is framing the foreign policy issues in a sort of fiscally conservative way, pointing out that one of the main things that's bankrupting the country, that's causing our fiscal crisis, is our ruinously expensive overseas adventurism. Ron Paul himself has both a moral and a prudential objection to this sort of overseas adventurism. I think him and I think later candidates who are not Ron Paul themselves might be able to do a better job honing in on the parts that a more standard right-winger might appreciate. I mean, when Ron Paul talks about applying the golden rule to our foreign policy, it's an incredibly brave thing to say, and I think an incredibly correct thing to say, but it scares a lot of Americans to think, hey, why do people overseas have problems with American behavior? A lot of Americans don't want to think like that, so it might be better in the future, if you're just trying to be a Republican's Republican, to try to explain to them, look, we cannot afford this anymore, which Ron Paul also says, but I think it maybe gets drowned out by some of the other stuff.
Well, and some of that other stuff includes, as Ron Paul says, some of these wars are bankrupting the U.S. government. They're making a lot of other people rich, a lot of other people who have a whole lot of influence. So that's sort of where the message gets muddled. Final question for you, Brian. Just want to know, now that essentially there are two men standing, are people going to start paying more attention to Ron Paul? And by people, I mean more of the mainstream media?
I hope so, but I'm not convinced it will occur. I think it's going to be easy for the press to just go, okay, it's over. We've still got that Ron Paul guy, spinning his wheels with his crazy crowds of 3,000 to 7,000 kids that he can attract. This is very important. I've been following Paul's campaign for my book from the beginning. The crowds he is drawing now are enormously larger than they were 2, 4, and 6 months ago. As his electoral prospects seem to get smaller, the passion he is engendering in these thousands of people, especially young people, is growing. So the Ron Paul movement is going to be significant way beyond what happens in Tampa or what happens in November. Yeah,
I was just at University of Maryland a couple weeks ago. 1,700 people filled the auditorium. They had to turn others away, all to hear Ron Paul speak for an hour. Pretty interesting stuff. Appreciate having you on the show. Brian Doherty, senior editor of Reason.com. He also wrote The Ron Paul Revolution, The Man and the Movement Inspired.